Hey everybody.
Hi there, welcome back to Planet and God. We are continuing our journey through the Gospel of Matthew. The goal and the idea is to finish this before the new year, but if you're not able to, that's okay. Everything's recorded, just go back in time and watch the old ones. So today we are on
Matthew chapter 23.
chapter 23. This is a fun one.
Yes.
So let's get into it.
All right, so it starts with Jesus talking to the multitudes and his disciples
Yes.
about the Pharisees.
Yes, he's
and
giving
the scribes.
an overview of them, characteristics of them, which is interesting. He starts off by mentioning in verse 2 that the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Now, Matthew, again, to a Jewish audience, will not say things or explain Jewish concepts. Moses' seat was like a stone chair. It was a stone chair that sat outside of the city gates, and it's where the Pharisees and the scribes would sit to cast civil judgments. So it's be like going to a judge for a civil dispute. That's Moses' seat. And so what Jesus is telling them here is to do what they say, but not what they do. So don't follow their actions because they are hypocrites.
Right.
That's going to be a key word throughout this chapter.
We go down to verse
4?
4.
Right, where he's talking about how they lay up heavy burdens that are hard to bear, right? The heavy burdens is reference to the oral law, the oral traditions, what would become the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Gemara. These are the traditions that they are forcing the people to follow.
Right.
Instead of the actual 613 laws of Moses.
So what I noticed with that was it took me back to Matthew 11:29 through 30.
Okay.
Which reads, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." So I thought it was an interesting comparison or contrast, between the two, right? Jesus is talking about his burden being light. And when you read verse 4, "For they bind heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers." So just showing that following Jesus is something that is easier, whereas following the law with the Pharisees.
No, right. Man's tradition is difficult to follow. It's a heavy burden to carry. For me, it took me back to the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5 and 6, where Jesus is doing that compare and contrast and going over, the differences between the Mosaic law and the Pharisaic law. And then even calling out the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, then how they would do things, laying down the heavy burdens of the law. They would do outward expressions like the phylacteries is what he brings up here. If you don't know what that is, it's a little box with prayers in it or the word of God in it that they would write down, and then they would wrap it around their head or on their arms. And so what he's saying is they build up these phylacteries. They make them bigger to make it look like they're more better. So you have the outward expressions, you have the large greetings, the titles, the best seats, right? These are all in contrast to what the actual Mosaic law would have them to do, which is what we see both in that verse and in Matthew's 5 and 6. The key point to the verse, to this section, is verse 12, really, where it reads, "Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." That we're not to seek the prominent positions, the titles,
Right.
the things seen by men, but we are to humbly serve the Lord.
Yep. So then we go into 13, which that's the beginning of the woes.
Yep, 13 through 33, and there are 7 woes that are pronounced here. So, question of the day, what is a woe?
It's like it's like a negative prophecy.
Negative prophecy.
Yeah, that's what I'm sticking with.
That's what you're sticking with. That's an interesting one. Kind of. It's a different dictionary definition is that it's an exclamation of judgment that denotes pain, discomfort, or unhappiness. So it's not good. You don't want a woe pronounced on you. And so there's 7 of them in this section, and you'll notice as you read through it that each one begins with the phrase, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." So he's going to say that every time, 7 times. And then throughout the passage, he calls them fools and blind a number of times. They're blind guides, they're blind, they're foolish and blind. So those are like some of the key phrases that Jesus will use throughout these woes.
You broke them down.
I did break them down, each one.
I did not.
I'm sorry.
I have little comments, though,
Yeah.
here and there, so I'll just
All right, so
sprinkle that in as you go.
all right, we'll go through them. So the first woe is in verse 13, right? They rejected the messianic claims of Jesus Christ, so they are now leading the people away from God instead of towards him. So they have a woe pronounced. Verse 14, they use their positions as judges, right? They were judges, the seed of Moses. They used that position to claim the property of wealthy widows or convince widows to give their estate to the Pharisees. So it's completely contrary to what the Mosaic Law would have them to do. So we have a woe. Verse 15 through 22, this shows the corruption of religious power. And really, this woe is like the reason for the woes, if you want to think of it that way. It's why Jesus is pronouncing woes on them, right? It says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel land and sea to win one proselyte, and when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves." Right? They're traveling at lengths, huge lengths, to bring someone into the Jewish faith and then turn that person around into someone that's more of a legalist than what they are.
Yeah, I thought it was really, especially like with verse 16 where it talks about the blind guides.
Yeah.
You know, if I then later found out that that's how I was being led, I would not be happy.
Right.
So it just brings me back to that thought of like,
Right.
you know, I'm so thankful that Jesus is leading me,
And not
right?
a
And
man.
he has warnings in here for a reason,
Right.
so that you aren't led by somebody like that.
Right.
So.
And what's really interesting, so out of the blind guides phrase that Jesus used, he uses it 3 times in this woe alone, calling them blind guides. And then our next woe, verses 23 through 24, essentially what he's saying in here is that they focused on the minor things of the Mosaic Law instead of the major things, right? They focused on the paying the tithe of mints and anise and cumin, right? These are spices. They're cheap, right? They focused on, hey, I need to pay this mint here. I just went and plucked it from my garden, and I'm paying that tithe, right? It's the minor thing. It's not a major part of the law. They would tithe the smallest of seed, but leave out the important things like faith and mercy. Again, Jesus calling them blind guides in this woe. Our next woe, 25 and 26, they concern themselves with the external demands of the law, not the internal, right? Still being hypocritical about it. 27 through 28, the 6th woe, for their hypocrisy, they're called whitewashed sepulchres. So a sepulcher is a tomb, contains dead bodies, and they would wash them white and keep them clean so that the Pharisees wouldn't touch them and become unclean, ceremonial unclean. And so they look good on the outside, but on the inside they are rotting corpses.
Right.
That's pretty crazy. And then the last woe number 7, 29 through 36, they're judged for rejecting the Messiah, whom they had the prophets. They had all of the prophecies. I think there's some 300 plus prophecies of Jesus Christ and the coming of the Messiah, and they've ignored them all. Messiah is here, and they've rejected him. So they have woe pronounced on them. That's the whole point from Abel to Zechariah. That's referencing the entirety of the Old Testament.
Right.
They've had it. and they've ignored it and rejected it. And so now they will be judged. That closes out the woes.
It does.
Whoa. And we get to wrapping up the chapter, verses 37 through 39. This here, now it's only fitting that now that Jesus has pronounced woes on the Jewish leadership, that now the chapter is going to wrap up essentially with the tears of the Messiah. He is going to lament over the destruction, the coming destruction, because of their rejection. That's going to happen in AD 70. Rome is going to come in and execute God's judgment on that generation. That's the whole point of the reference there, your house is left to you desolate.
The last section goes into, like, during the tribulation.
Yes, and then it wraps up with a prophecy of the second coming of the Messiah.
Yeah.
So you have the judgment that's cast on that generation, and then a future generation is going to cry out to Messiah, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," referencing Psalm 118, verse 26. That is the official messianic greeting. So just as the Jewish leaders had led in the rejection of the Messiah, a future generation of Jewish leaders will lead in the cry to have Messiah come.
Yeah, really cool.
It is really cool.
So, got anything else?
No, I think that wraps up chapter 23.
Yes.
It's a pretty crazy chapter. Lots of judgment,
Yep.
lots of crying. I would be crying if I had 7 woes pronounced on me.
Follows.
There's a lot of woes.
All right. Well, we will see you in the next chapter.
Yep, Matthew 24.
All right. Bye.
Bye.